Our passage from Matthew today is so weird, isn't it? Maybe it's overly familiar since all three synoptics record it, so we hear it the last Sunday before Lent every year, and again on the Feast of the Transfiguration in August, if we celebrate that. 6 days after Peter professes that Jesus is the Christ, God's anointed one, Jesus goes up on a mountain and takes 3 companions, 3 of his disciples with him. 6 days after Peter professes that Jesus is the Christ, God's anointed one, and 6 days after Jesus tells Peter and the disciples that he will be handed over and put to death, Jesus is transfigured. What does that even mean? The Greek here is very, very difficult to render, and why I got a C in Greek in seminary, because this was the final. The words are weird. Matthew tells us that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became dazzling white, like sparkly, not just Billy May with OxyClean white. Like, wow! Then with him are Moses and Elijah, the embodiments of the law and the prophets, which Jesus has come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Peter, sensing God's true presence and never at a loss for words, whether they're needed or not, wants to build dwellings for these people. Knowing that God is there, Peter wants to make habitations to keep Jesus, Moses, and Elijah safe in their spots, safe from the elements. But he also wants to keep those around them safe from the awesomeness that is being with God. And as Peter starts to suggest building with what supplies or tools, I don't know, a bright cloud overshadows them, and a voice booms from it. We hear the words we heard at Jesus' baptism, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased." And the voice adds, "Listen to him." Beyond seeing God's presence, hearing the voice of God terrifies the disciples. They fall to their knees in awe and fear. Jesus, their friend and teacher, goes to them, touches them, and comforts them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." The disciples have had an ecstatic experience, both seeing God's representatives and hearing God's voice. The ecstatic experience is not what the voice emphasizes, though. Something happens on the mountain, but that's not the end of the story for Jesus or his disciples. While Matthew does not write about God becoming flesh and dwelling among us the way John does, Matthew does write about God with us. God in the mess of things in the person of Jesus. Something happened on the mountain, and God confirmed that Jesus is God's anointed and God's chosen one. Something happened on the mountain that can be too extreme or just too fantastic for us to understand, comprehend, or even think about. Yet after Peter proclaims that Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus predicts his own death for the first time, voicing his willingness to be a part of the cosmic plan, God shows up and confirms it. "This is my Son, the beloved. With him who is willing to suffer at the hands of those he's come to redeem, I am well pleased. Listen to him." listen to him. Jesus and the disciples, after the disciples are struck with fear, after Jesus comforts them, after Moses and Elijah are gone, Jesus and the disciples leave the mountain. Despite the text's suggestions, the best guessed at mountain isn't really that big, especially with the young mountains we have around us, Rainier and Baker. Nonetheless, it's a thin space, a place where heaven and earth meet. After the meeting of heaven and earth, these four come down from the heavenly realm and go back to the valley where there are needs to be met. Next week, we are fully in Lent and hear about Jesus' temptation as we do the first Sunday of Lent every year. But what happens in Matthew's narrative after Jesus' transfiguration that we hear today is Jesus healing a boy with a demon, then continuing to teach before healing blind men on the way to Jerusalem. He comes down from the mountain and gets back to work healing. This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. For the disciples through time, Peter, James, John, us, mountaintop experiences may be a part of our story. We may deeply encounter God at camp, or on pilgrimage, or at Cursillo, or in our private prayer, or at a revival. Those are beautiful and holy experiences. They can knock us off our feet and bring Jesus to us, offering comfort and assurance. Matthew and God make clear today that those are not the end points. They're not the objective. They're not what's being sought. In adding, listen to him, to the pronunciation of God's being pleased, God is directing us in how to live. As Anna Case Winters puts it, the ascent to the heights of the mountain and peak experiences of encounter with God are followed by descent into suffering and service in the valley of need where God's calling beckons. If our lives are not transformed by meeting Jesus the Christ, by encountering the true and living God, the encounter is for naught. In seeing Jesus' transfigured body, in holding Jesus in our hands as bread, God admonishes us to listen to Jesus. Mountaintop experiences, going to thin places, are for the good of the world, not just the good of our feelings. As we keep going through this year with Matthew, into Lent next week, sorting out that which separates us from God and building us up that which brings us closer, listen to Jesus. Reflect on what we've heard these last few weeks, from the Beatitudes to, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Listen to Jesus. We'll get into more parables and more direct teaching in the summer. I hope that the Easter Vigil or Easter Day, we have a mountaintop experience. Mountaintop experiences aren't the end point. They're way stations to build us up to be God's agents of transformation in the suffering valleys around us. while Peter was still speaking, not listening, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Amen.